Hi, I'm Pranshu and I will be discussing the cost structures for New South Wales waste disposal and recycling. I'll apply the short run cost framework to landfill operators in New South Wales first. Fixed capital is substantial: land acquisition, linear systems, monitoring infrastructure, and compaction machinery. These cannot be adjusted as throughput changes, they're committed upfront. This is the fixed input assumption directly from our frameworks. Variable costs, labor, fuel, and daily cover, they move with output. But the most important critical variable is the New South Wales waste levy, $171.2 per tonne in the metropolitan levy areas from July 2025. This is a 4% increase in a single year. Because it's charged per tonne received, it sits directly on the marginal cost curve. Cleanaway, Australia's largest publicly listed waste company, illustrates this cleanly in their FY25 reports. Gross revenue was $3.85 billion, but net revenue was $3.3 billion. That $548 million gap is the levy passed directly to government. 14.2% of every gross revenue dollar treated as explicitly as a variable pass-through cost, not operating income. Moving on to recyclable facilities, MRFs, materials recovery facilities have a fundamentally different cost structure. Fixed costs dominate: optical sorters, conveyors, and balers require large upfront capital. Variable costs per ton are lower, but labor intensity is higher because sorting requires more workers per ton than landfill compaction. The critical distinction is that recycling facilities are exempt from the New South Wales waste levy. This deliberately engineers a wedge between the two marginal cost curves, making recycling progressively more cost competitive over time. There is an important short-run constraint, however. Cleanaway's Western Sydney MRF, which opened in April 2025, is still absorbing ramp-up costs. This is the textbook definition of economies of scale. HEC remains elevated when capital is committed but volume hasn't scaled to match. The long-run marginal cost curve for recycling is flatter, but only once sufficient throughput spreads fixed costs. Now, we know that firms minimize costs at every output level. When input prices change, the cost minimizing combination shifts. I'll walk through the four key inputs here. The levy at $171.2 per tonne, which has risen annually with the CPI. Every increase is a direct upward shift in landfill's marginal cost curve. Recycling's marginal curve is completely unaffected. This asymmetry is the primary mechanism through which policy is reshaping production decisions. On the fuel, in April 2026, Cleanaway issued a ASX update attributing a $20 million reduction in the FY EBIT guidance to rising fuel costs from the Middle East conflict, a real-world marginal shift from an external shock. They noted and said that the prices reset July 2026. So in the short run, they absorb the cost, but in the long run, they will pass it through, which again is aligned with our economic frameworks. Moving on to labor, Cleanaway's FY25 results show a 130 basis point improvement in EBIT margin from labor efficiency gains, with New South Wales specifically named. The movement confirms labor is large enough to shift aggregate margins materially. Finally, land. The New South Wales EPA confirms Greater Sydney's landfills reach capacity by 2030, with no viable new sites identified. When land for expansion is unavailable, operators cannot move along their long-run expansion path. The AFC stays elevated, fixed costs cannot be spread over greater volume. So how do these cost structures actually drive decisions in New South Wales? At Lucas Heights, Sydney's main metropolitan landfill, Cleanaway's FY25 results explicitly reference density management at tight cost control to offset lower incoming volumes. That is a firm actively managing to stay above average variable cost in the short run. In the long run, the response is capital substitution. Cleanaway's fleet transformation program, targeting over $50 million in EBIT improvement, replaces high maintenance older vehicles with efficient capital, a deliberate movement down the long run average cost curve. The aggregate result: New South Wales recycling rate has stagnated around 65 to 66%. Cost structures explain that ceiling. For contaminated household waste, landfill marginal cost is still lower despite the levy. But with Greater Sydney's landfills projected to reach capacity by 2030, land scarcity will ultimately force the production decision towards recycling regardless of the relative marginal cost. I will now hand over to Sartaj, who will examine the economies of scale for this sector.
Now, before evaluating whether the New South Wales waste sector exhibits an economies of scale, we need to establish the theoretical understanding. Economies of scale occur when costs rise more slowly than production. The more a firm produces, the lower its average cost per unit. We can see this through the long-run average cost curve on the right side of the screen. As output expands, the LRAC falls through an economies of scale region, reaching its minimum at what we call the minimum efficient scale, or the MES, the output level which a firm achieves its lowest possible per unit cost. Beyond the MES, diseconomies set in and costs rise. In capital-intensive industries like waste management, MES sits very high, meaning that firms must already be operating at enormous scale just to compete. So, what drives economies of scale in the New South Wales waste disposal? There are five key sources. First, there are high fixed infrastructure costs, such as landfills, processing plants, and truck fleets that require massive upfront capital that gets spread over more output as the firm grows. Secondly, economies of density. In dense urban areas like Greater Sydney, firms service more households per kilometre, lowering fuel and labour costs per pickup. Third is specialized technology such as automated sorting and waste to energy plants that carry high fixed costs but dramatically reduce as per unit costs at scale. Fourth is vertical integration, which is where we own the full supply chain from the collection stage all the way to the disposal stage, and cost savings are captured at every stage. Fifth is purchasing economies. Large firms negotiate bulk discounts on inputs such as fuel, vehicles, and machinery. However, diseconomies of scale can also emerge. In regional New South Wales, sparse populations mean that collection routes become long with fewer households per kilometre, and trucks return partially empty, raising the cost per ton collected. This is what we call a diseconomies of density. Furthermore, as firms expand across hundreds of sites, organizational complexity grows, with more management layers eroding the earlier savings. Thirdly, when facilities operate beyond their optimal capacity, throughput slows and the system slows as well, and maintenance costs rise. For landfills nearing capacity, waste must be transported even further, directly raising marginal cost. So we can see that the long run average cost is genuinely U-shaped, where there is a significant economies of scale that dominate at metro scale, but diseconomies emerge in the regional context. And as I've said earlier, economies of scale have an extensive impact to the structure of the New South Wales disposal industry. We can best illustrate this through this cycle over here, as the dynamics directly shape the industry structure in a self-reinforcing way, where large firms achieve lower average cost that reach MES, securing a cost advantage smaller rivals that simply cannot match. New entrants face high barriers. They must immediately achieve the same scale, requiring an enormous capital investment initially. Firms that cannot reach MES face higher costs than its incumbents and eventually exit. What remains is a small number of large firms dominating the market, which is the definition of an oligopoly. The ACCC has confirmed this, identifying critical scale, large capital investment, and extensive infrastructure as necessary just to compete effectively in this sector. So we beg to ask the questions, do economies of scale actually improve efficiency or raise competition concerns? Well, the answer is both, and there's a genuine trade-off. On the efficiency side, large firms achieve lower average costs, enabling investment in large technology and advanced technology and broader coverage across New South Wales. On the competition side, as smaller firms exit, market power concentrates in the hands of large players such as Cleanaway, Veolia, and Bingo Industries, giving them a greater control over pricing. The ACCC has demonstrated their concern in practice, raising concerns about a major firm in Newcastle called Igneo Infrastructure and their proposed acquisition of Benedict Recycling, merging with them, warning that it would likely result in higher prices, fewer alternatives, and reduced service quality. Now, to tie our understanding of economies of scale together, Cleanaway is the perfect case study. They operate over 300 sites, 5,000 vehicles, serving 88 councils and 140,000 customers. Cleanaway demonstrates every source of economies of scales that we've already discussed: infrastructure economies through owning recycling plants and landfills, density economics and economies through optimized collection routes, and specialized technology through automated sorting and waste to energy systems. But like I've mentioned before, Cleanaway also illustrates the competition concern. While their scale delivers a lower average cost and broader service coverage, the ACCC has raised concerns about their acquisition of their competitor Citywide Waste, warning that it could entrench Cleanaway's dominant position, enabling even higher prices and reduced service quality for downstream customers. Cleanaway is the literal concept of this very trade-off in a single firm, where there are substantial efficiency gains, but a market position draws direct regulatory scrutiny. A deeper assessment of this market power will be conducted next by Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sataj, for discussing the economies of scale in the waste industry. I, Jordan, will now assess further into market power. We will first discuss the sources of market power, where my first point is in geographic constraints. Scarcity of landfill sites will make transport costs more expensive due to the size of landfill sites, which holds millions and billions of tons of waste. Hence, disposal facilities must then be within practical hauling distances. For example, Veolia are one of the firms with fully integrated waste processes in Sydney, with a network of transfer stations and a protestable landfill. These demonstrate the differences in market power between firms due to availability of land, which brings me to my next point, the available ownership of landfill sites. Firms with landfills, transfer stations, and recycling infrastructure typically controls the market. This is due to vertical integration developed by firms having an influential control over these facilities and can increase costs for competitors by limiting access to landfills through higher gate fees. Planning regulations can also play a big role here as a entry barrier for smaller firms, because larger firms will then hold EPA licensing, also known as Environment Protection Authority licensing, making it more challenging for potential entrants to establish competing landfills and acquire relevant infrastructures. These regulations typically include environmental assessments, planning approvals, and waste levies, which could act as a form of protection to major waste operators. Lastly, we can look into long-term council contracts. Multi-year contracts between local councils and major waste operators can create economies of scale, which will reduce competition from potential competitors. Limited competition can also weaken bargaining power of councils, allowing waste operators to charge as high as they can. Now we can look into how market power affects pricing behavior. We can first look into landfill levies. Waste levies are charged per ton, which is discussed by Pranshu in the first section of cost structures. Since there are not many landfills available with limited ownership and relatively inelastic demand for waste disposal, levy charges can typically pass on to consumers through higher prices, because firms can try to protect their profit margins when levy rises. For example, a large proportion of waste was transported to Queensland in 2019. This is because there were no levies imposed at the moment, and this helped waste operators to save on disposal costs. Next, we can look into households' waste charges as well. Households are typically inelastic towards price changes by local councils due to limited number of waste providers. This allows waste operators to extract as much surplus as they can while competing with rivals. However, according to IPART, Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, New South Wales, councils cannot charge households above their cost of services. This means that households essentially pay for how much waste operators charge. Lastly, we will look at recycling fees. According to the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, there will be no new facilities required in Greater Sydney, only upgrades to the current MRFs, materials recovery facilities, which can limit competition and create an incentive for these facilities to charge a higher markup. Now we can do a comparison between the observed outcome in the waste industry and a predictive or theoretical perfectly competitive market competition. We can look into aspects such as entry barriers. There are low entry barriers in the competitive market with easily accessible resources and requires low capital, whereas in the waste industry, there's high entry barrier with more regulations, land scarcity, and requires a large amount of capital. There are many firms in the competitive market which sells identical products, whereas in the waste industry, there are limited waste operators providing differentiated services. The pricing strategy is different, however, in the competitive market, as firms act as price takers and charge according to the marginal cost. However, in the waste industry, firms make strategic decisions and charge a markup. Product innovation, however, in the competitive market is higher due to more competition, as firms compete to produce new products and to gain revenue, also known as cycle of innovation. Whereas in the waste industry, product innovation is halted due to long-term contracts with councils. Substitutes, however, there are many substitutes in the competitive market since consumers have many choices, whereas in the waste industry, consumer choice is limited because households generally cannot switch between waste providers. In summary, we can conclude that waste operators have market power and can charge above their marginal cost. Then demand for recycled materials can be reduced, not just because of the price, but because of poor quality of sorted waste as well. These, combined with increased waste volumes, are likely to reach maximum landfill capacity in the next decade. This means that at its current rate, the economy is producing more than it's supposed to, causing social and environmental issues, which will then be discussed by James in the next section.
Hello,
In this section, I'll be discussing externalities involved in the New South Wales waste and recycling sector. I'll start by describing the positive and negative externalities associated with landfill use and recycling. So what are the negative externalities of landfill use? Firstly, landfill takes up a significant amount of space which could be used for more productive purposes, such as housing. Secondly, leaching of toxic chemicals from landfill can contaminate groundwater and soil systems. This could damage human health and the environment. Thirdly, through releasing methane, landfill can pollute the atmosphere and contribute to global warming. These costs are all borne by society, so each extra unit of waste sent to landfill creates a marginal external cost on top of the marginal private cost. Now, what are the positive externalities of recycling? Firstly, recycling leads to less depletion of finite resources because materials are reused and repurposed. Secondly, the lower energy needed to recycle than to produce new items, as well as the avoidance of landfill use, results in less air pollution and carbon emissions. These benefits are all enjoyed by society, so each additional unit of recycling generates a marginal external benefit on top of the marginal private benefit derived by individuals. Moving on, so markets are inefficient where externalities exist because the market equilibrium only accounts for private benefits and costs, not the full societal impacts. Intervention, therefore, is necessary to move the market equilibrium quantity towards the socially optimum level. Otherwise, the market will be inefficient. So let's look at this in practice. As I explained earlier, landfill imposes an external cost on society. As shown, the equilibrium quantity of landfill use is higher than the socially optimum quantity. This means that more waste is going to landfill than desirable for society. Therefore, without any intervention to reduce landfill use, the market is inefficient and deadweight loss is created. Conversely, recycling confers external benefits on society, so it is like a mirror image of landfill use. As the graph illustrates, the equilibrium quantity of recycling is lower than the socially optimum quantity, meaning there is less recycling than desirable for society. Hence, without any intervention to increase recycling, deadweight loss is generated and market inefficiency will arise. Now I will evaluate New South Wales government policies and schemes introduced that attempt to address these externalities. As Pranchu mentioned in Part A, New South Wales imposes a $171 levy per tonne of waste disposed in landfill. If this levy equals the marginal cost of landfill, the socially optimum quantity will be achieved and the market efficiency will be corrected. However, due to difficulties quantifying variables like environmental and health damages, it is challenging for the government to estimate the social cost of landfill. Consequently, the levy may reduce inefficiency but not completely eliminate it. The landfill levy financially incentivizes waste companies to reduce landfill use and recycle more. Statistics indicate that the levy helps divert around 3 million tonnes of waste annually. This figure has been maintained over the last 9 years. However, total waste generation has risen by 20% from 2016 to 2025, meaning landfill volumes also continue to increase. This limits the levy's ability to attain long-term efficiency and indicates that the incentives are insufficient. Overall, welfare outcomes are improved as society enjoys the benefits of less landfill use, but further reform is necessary. Next, the New South Wales Government's Waste and Sustainable Materials Strategy 2041 includes strategies to achieve an 80% recycling rate by 2030. The target aims to maximise market efficiency by increasing the quantity of recycling towards the socially optimum amount. However, the recycling rate has plateaued at around 65% for the last decade and is not on track to reach the 80% target by 2030. This suggests that incentives to recycle more are insufficient. So, society benefits from the increased recycling that these targets encourage, but ultimately further government action is needed to incentivise more recycling and maximise welfare. Moving on, the Return and Earn scheme enables individuals to deposit containers like plastic bottles in exchange for 10% per container. As the amount of recycling increases towards the optimum quantity, market inefficiency is reduced, though not completely, as only certain containers can be deposited. With over 13 billion containers recycled and 82% adult participation in the scheme since its inception, Return and Earn has effectively incentivized individuals to recycle, causing them to internalize the externality. Individuals are better off as they become 10 cents richer from each item they recycle, and society enjoys the benefits of more recycling, so overall welfare improves. That concludes my section on externalities. Next, James will discuss economic incentives and propose a policy.
Thank you. Following on from the analysis of externalities and current government interventions, I will be evaluating how economic incentives shape behaviour in the New South Wales waste sector and proposing a structural policy reform. Ultimately, the effectiveness of any waste management system depends on the microeconomic decisions made at the household and firm levels every single day. The key point is that waste decisions are not only environmental choices, they are also marginal economic choices. The household and firms respond to the private costs and benefits they face when deciding whether to reduce waste, sort materials, recycle, or dispose of waste in landfill. New South Wales already has an important price-based instrument, the Waste Levy. In 2025 to 26, the levy is $174.20 per tonne in the metropolitan levy area and $100.30 per tonne in the regional levy area, rising in 26 to 27 to $180.20 and $103.80 respectively. This works like a landfill tax. It raises the private cost of landfill disposal and makes recycling and resource recovery relatively more attractive. However, the behavioral effect is uneven. Firms usually face more direct and variable waste charges, so they have a clearer incentive to sort waste, reduce contamination, renegotiate collection contracts, or redesign production and procurement. For example, a business that can reduce residual waste by 1 tonne can avoid part of the disposal cost and the levy pass-through by waste contractors. In microeconomic terms, the marginal private cost of landfill is visible to the firm. Households face a weaker incentive. Many households pay for waste through council rates and fixed service charges, so the marginal private cost of placing one additional item in the red bin is close to zero. This creates a wedge between private and social costs. The social cost introduces landfill scarcity, emissions, odor, local amenity impacts, and the opportunity cost of lost recoverable items. This means households may overuse landfill, even when recycling or source separation would be the more socially efficient alternative. The evidence suggests New South Wales needs stronger marginal incentives. New South Wales waste volumes increased from 18.7 million tonnes in 2015 to 16 to 22.4 million tonnes in 22 to 23, with around 7.7 million tonnes still going to landfill. Recycling rates have stagnated at around 65 to 66%, below the 80% recovery target for 2030. Greater Sydney also faces a landfill capacity problem, with landfill capacity projected to run out by 2030 unless urgent action is taken. My proposed reform is a staged variable residual waste pricing system for New South Wales councils. Under this system, households would receive a basic red bin allowance, but would pay more for larger red bins, excess pickups, excess residual waste by weight where technology allows. Recycling and FOGO services should remain free or cheaper at the margin. That matters because the policy should not simply make waste management more expensive. It should change relative prices so that landfill becomes the costly option and recycling, reuse, and organic separation becomes the cheaper alternative. This reform is economically sound because it targets marginal behavior. A flat charge does not reward a household that halves its residual waste. A variable charge does. It also improves allocative efficiency by moving private decision-making closer to the social cost of landfill. In supply and demand terms, it operates like a Bergouvian tax on residual waste. The private marginal cost of landfill is shifted upwards, reducing landfill quantity towards the socially efficient level. The policy should be paired with New South Wales' FOGO transition. New South Wales has staged source separation collection of food organics and garden organics, including household FOGO collections from 2030. This is important because household red bins contain around 1/3 food waste, and EPA analysis suggests household FOGO mandates could divert almost 950,000 tonnes of landfill per year. There are risks. If the price is too high or poorly enforced, households may dump illegally or contaminate recycling bins. If apartment buildings lack infrastructure, residents may be unable to respond effectively. Therefore, the policy should include a basic allowance, low-income protections, apartment-specific infrastructure, clear labeling, contamination feedback, and enforcement against dumping. Overall, the reform is not just about raising prices. It is about making the correct marginal choice cheaper and the socially costly option more expensive. That is why variable residual waste pricing, combined with FOGO and recycling support, is a stronger incentive-based policy for New South Wales than relying only on upstream landfill levies.